So what is DSEAR? Well, DSEAR is an acronym, very simply, for the Dangerous Substances and Explosive Atmospheres Regulations. They came into effect on the 9th of December 2002, and as you can see, they implement two specific European directives, one being the Explosive Atmospheres Directive, and then some aspects of the Chemical Agents Directive. As you know, a lot of the legislation in the UK is derived from European directives, and we implement legislation to enact those directives directly. And the legislation is there really for the protection of life, as most legislation is, but looking quite specifically at the risks from fire and explosion and similar events that might arise from the use, the storage, the handling, the mixing and such like of dangerous substances that you might have in the workplace. There were some amendments to the DSEAR regulations in June 2015. I'll touch on those in a little bit more detail in a moment, but they drew into the auspices of the regulations gases stored, or all gases stored under pressure, and substances that might be corrosive to metal. So they're quite broad in their application. So what do the legislations actually require? Well, they impose requirements for eliminating or reducing risks to safety from fire, explosion or other events arising from the hazardous properties of any dangerous substances used in connection with work processes being undertaken. And it's important that we just reflect on the word process there for a moment, and I'll come back to that in a minute, but process being an important word in that particular sentence. And the employer, whoever that might be, has to undertake a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risks to their employees. Again, this is all about life safety and other relevant persons where a dangerous substance is or may be present. So in some cases, you may have substances which aren't necessarily dangerous, but when you mix them together, they become dangerous or they become more dangerous. So again, it's important that we understand that. And the paragraph underneath that first one there just explains what the regulation says, where a dangerous substance is or liable to be present in the workplace, like a suitable assessment of the risks to employees which arise from that substance. So it's really very clear, not dissimilar to the kinds of risk assessments that we do under the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order for general fire precautions, but at the same time we do need to consider risks and make sure that what we've done to best control and mitigate them. There is a bit of crossover between the Dangerous Substances and Explosive Atmospheres regulations and the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, and the same will apply in Scotland and Northern Ireland, where the legislation is slightly different, but still makes very similar requirements. What we can see within the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order in Article 12 replicates to a certain degree what we see in Regulation 5 of the DSEAR assessments. So it says in the RRO, when a dangerous substance is present, the responsible person must ensure the risk to relevant persons related to the presence of the substances is eliminated or reduced. Then goes on to talk about how you go about that, i.e. replacing it where you can, or use the dangerous, or changing the use of the substance, and using something or a process which either eliminates or reduces the risk to relevant persons. Then in circumstances where you can't do that, because clearly some processes are going to require you to use hazardous substances, you have to make sure that your risk assessment looks at how you're going to control the risk that remains and also mitigate any detrimental effects of a fire or explosion that might occur. And I know Marcus will come onto this in a bit more detail later on, because we're really talking about a hierarchy here of controls, which I know he's going to cover off. So okay, so that's the regulations, that's the legislation, that's how it all pertains and actually impacts. But what do we have in terms of support and guidance which will help us make sure our premises are safe? Well, as is common to most bits of legislation, there is plenty of guidance and approved codes of practice out there. And by working within the auspices of an approved code of practice, it's one of those ways of showing, should you ever be challenged, that you are doing the very best in terms of managing the risks that may exist from the use and storage of hazardous materials on your site. And there's just a list of a few of them there. There's an approved code of practice, which is otherwise called L138. All of the documents on this page, they're entirely free to download from the Health and Safety Executive website, which we've given at the bottom there. So the approved code of practice is the primary document, really, but then there are another number of others which actually support that. L133, unloading of petrol from tankers, but those others beneath there have been incorporated into the main L138 ACOP and have hence been withdrawn. You can still find them if you go looking for them, but in general terms, if you're using the main ACOP, you've probably got all that you need in terms of that level of advice and guidance as to how to get things right. But in addition to that, as you would expect, there are also a number of British standards, and I've just listed a few of them here. These are particularly useful because they deal with classification of areas for explosive gas atmospheres, explosive dust atmospheres, and the design, selection and installation of electrical installations in explosive atmospheres. I'm not going to dwell too much on the classification of areas or any of those issues, because that's something that Marcus will be touching on in a few moments' time. But it will make a bit more sense to you when we get to that point. Basically, we need to decide which areas in our premises are dangerous, and we need to take effective precautions in those spaces to ensure that we minimise risk or minimise the potential for an explosion. So, do the regulations actually apply to your workplace? Well, first and foremostly, you have to identify whether you have dangerous substances. And as I was suggesting earlier, sometimes with things like diesel, people don't realise that that actually falls under the auspices of the legislation. Similarly, with compressed gases in cylinders, there are a few anomalies in there. For example, in healthcare premises, the pipe work and distribution network for medical gases, which come from cylinders under pressure and pressurised themselves, they do come under the auspices of the legislation, but the point at which they're actually used for the treatment of patients does not fall under the DSEAR regulation. So there are a few anomalies in there, but in general terms, you need to be able to identify these dangerous substances, and these are defined as substances or preparations that are classified as explosive, oxidizing, extremely flammable, highly flammable, or flammable.